Sure. Welcome everybody to this special seminar of the Early Modern Literature and Culture Group based in the English department at the University of Sydney. It's wonderful to see you all and thank you for joining us, especially those who have stayed up late into the night. And as we commence, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Indigenous Wallamedigal people on whose land I stand and from whose land I'm Zooming today. And this EMLAC seminar is dedicated to discussion of Coriolanus' Critical Reader, which was published at the start of the year. We'll have brief presentations from the contributors to the book and then open discussion of the ideas raised. All the contributors are here except for Graham Holderness, who's unable to make it, but sends his apologies and warmest wishes for the event. I don't plan to go into long introductions for our speakers. I'd much rather we enjoyed their ideas than their CVs, but I'm really grateful for them being here. Huw Griffiths, Rob Ormsby, Anna Kamaralli, Evelyn Gajowski, Jennifer Bates, Hugh Craig, and Claire Hansen. The session will run for an hour and a half, and our speakers will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I know this is hard, but we're going, since there's 8 of us, we'll try to be succinct. And to help with the flow, we'll just pass the baton on from one speaker to the next. I can remind you of the order as we go. And you could just say who you are as you commence your presentation. Please keep your mics on mute if you're not speaking. We'd love to see you, of course, but we know there are many reasons why you might have your camera off, and that's totally fine. Feel free to comment in the chat, even as the presentations are going, or to tweet, because that can be a really good way of registering and reacting to ideas and having a fruitful parallel conversation during the presentations. To the book. This book was a joy to pull together. When series editors Andrew Hiscock and Lisa Hopkins approached me, I felt so honoured to be asked and absolutely delighted to immerse myself then in Coriolanus. And I was intent on producing a volume that had some multidisciplinary reach and also a balance of male and female authors. And I approached scholars that I respect enormously, but I also hoped that their work would create this sort of reach that I was seeking and stretch the reader by speaking from or into disparate disciplines or methodologies or approaches. And I'm so grateful that you all said yes. And at the end of the introduction, I assert that the play, Coriolanus, deserves an orchestra of disciplines tackling it because there's a lot in this play. In some respects, the result then is a book, I think, which is not the easiest to read. But I don't think I was aiming for an easy to read book, although I've got to say all the authors are really lucid in the way they present their material. But what I'm referring to is the different angles or approaches or methodologies that they engage with. So I was after the quality and the reach, and I got that, and I'm just so pleased about that. I did cause a bit of a headache for the publisher. I'm so sorry, Laura Bateman and Mark Dudgeon at Bloomsbury. You were both extremely gracious when I blew up the word limit. That was accidental. On the upside, anyone who buys this book will get value for money, deep immersion in an array of mind-expanding explorations of the play. I'd like to read a couple of bits from the book, starting with the beginning of the acknowledgements as a form of orientation. To the health workers around the world who served the sick and dying during the COVID-19 global pandemic, 2019 to 2020, thank you. 5th century BC, early Roman Republic, grain shortages, pestilence, civil unrest. The Coriolanus myth begins. 1605 to 10, Jacobean England, grain shortages, plague, Midlands rising. Shakespeare writes Coriolanus. 2019 to 2020, Australia, megafires, coronavirus, lockdown. Semler edits Coriolanus, a critical reader. Coriolanus is surely a book for our time, and I wanted to present readers with a rich array in the introduction, a rich array of ideas that would be leaping off points. So my task in writing the introduction was to see how much material I could put in that would be interesting and trigger different approaches to the play, particularly for student readers or readers who are fresh to the play, and at the same time to try to present a coherent narrative about the play. I'll read a couple of paragraphs from the introduction. Shakespeare's Coriolanus is a compelling and intriguing play. From its turbulent opening scene of desperate citizen revolt, all resolved to die rather than to famish, to Marcius's venomous slapdown, "What's the matter, you dissentious rogues?" The audience is strapped in for an intense character study of a protagonist who thrives on conflict, or, to put it more emphatically, violent contest. The play stages scene after scene of emotional intensity, reaching from the battle cries of heroic military leaders through to the heavy silences of domestic encounters and everything in between. Class resentments, strained friendships, patriotic drive, pragmatic scheming, and family ties are all on show. And the play holds its audience, not just by the ferocious masculinity of its protagonist, but also by the panoply of feelings that Shakespeare invites us to witness and share. And our guide through this bumpy, yet quintessentially dramatic terrain of agon and emotion is Caius Marcius, later named Coriolanus. He leads the play as he leads his soldiers and is everywhere talked of. Coriolanus is a long play, but it is driven speedily to its inexorable conclusion by the intensity of its dialogue and the decisiveness of its protagonist. The bluntness of this character and the clarity of his progress through highly charged scenes carry the audience swiftly on and tend to hide another substantial achievement. And this is Shakespeare's representation of early Roman Republic as a live political entity entailing the state, the family, and the individual. It is the assured theatrical combination of strident character, lucid plotting, and vivid setting, each highly specific, yet each contributing in just the right proportions to create a compelling story and subtle interrogation of the political, which makes the play as a play so impressive. And so I think of the play as this beautiful evolving thought experiment in politics, where you can see Shakespeare dedicated to immersing himself in spending extended time on examining political interactions without excuse or anxiety. That's what he focuses on. And the political essence of the play arises in every chapter of this critical reader, whatever the angle, whether it's theatre history or critical history, philosophical drawing on Hegel, or presentist thinking of US politics, or emotion embodiment, computer-assisted textual analysis, or pedagogy. Politics keeps emerging. We'll see this in the presentations to which we now turn, in which each contributor will say something about his or her chapter and might make a brief comment about another chapter in the book. And in that spirit, I might just insert a quick comment here about Rob Ormsby's chapter on the play's performance history. I was so lucky to have Rob agree to compose that chapter on the theatrical history of Coriolanus, because he's got unparalleled knowledge about this topic with an enormous amount of publications, including a monograph, at least a monograph on this subject already. And you can see the accumulated wisdom in his chapter when he's describing the temporal reach of Coriolanus, but also the global reach. And that's a particularly important part of Rob's chapter. And I'll just conclude by reading a tiny bit from just a sentence or so from the end of Rob's chapter, because when he deals with Japanese productions or Robert Lepage's work, thinking very globally and asking questions about how we represent Coriolanus, it really raises questions about the nature of the play. And he concludes, what seems certain is that the more we know about Coriolanus's global performance history, the more the desire to adopt a custodial approach to Shakespeare's text and inherited meanings, which has not stopped artists from radically adapting Coriolanus, but is still fundamental to 21st century Anglo-North American journalistic writing about Shakespearean performance, seems like a vestige of the past. So that desire to adopt a custodial approach to Shakespeare's text and inherited meanings seems like a vestige of the past. And in many ways, I think, and I hope this book, I hope it does contribute to the expansion of the way we can approach and think about Coriolanus and get away from the vestiges of the past. I'd like now to hand over to Huw Griffiths to kick us off with his thoughts on his contribution to the book. Thanks, Huw.
Thanks, Liam. And if I'm momentarily distracted, and it's because an enormous huntsman spider has just landed on the window in front of me. and I'd love to be able to show it to our non-Australian friends, because only in Australia could you be in a Shakespeare seminar with an enormous spider in front of you. So if I look like that occasionally, that's what I'm looking at. They're very friendly, but quite alarming. Thanks, Liam, both for the event and for the book. I can honestly say that putting the chapter together was a genuine pleasure. It's always pleasurable, invigorating even, I think, to consider the work of literary criticism over centuries of time, which is what I was invited to do. So to look at the critical backstory, the critical history of Coriolanus from the 17th through to the 21st century, and bracing, of course, to read people getting to grips with questions that we might ourselves be still thinking about in our libraries or classrooms or the Zoomscapes of 21st century learning. I didn't fully know what I would find or what I'd become interested in when I started working on the chapter, although I was working on it in parallel with another project where I was writing for another Arden collection, actually, on the Restoration and 18th century adaptations of Coriolanus, but with a particular lens in that circumstance on kind of homoerotic responses. So I was kind of in the zone, but this more systematic look could have thrown anything up. And that's why I kind of really enjoyed it, that idea of setting myself a project. And the moment that ended up really speaking to me was the emergence of Coriolanus as a player in the British culture wars during the aftermath of the French Revolution in the early 19th century. One of the more interesting responses to Coriolanus that I ended up writing about is that of Elizabeth Inchbald, the novelist and actor, in an introduction that she wrote to the play in 1808. And she writes about Coriolanus. She writes, certain sentences in this play are of dangerous tendency at certain times, though at other periods they are welcomed with loud applause. When Londoners are happy with their lot, she's suggesting, they can watch Coriolanus without getting all riled up about injustice. But if there's some idea that they might be disgruntled with their treatment at the hands of the ruling classes, then this play becomes really quite problematic. And of course, Inchbald is writing during a perilous political moment, a moment where England and Wales may easily have tipped over into popular revolution, the era of Chartism, the Rebecca riots, and when the Peterloo massacre is just 9 years away. Coriolanus at this moment, as at others, becomes a player in English culture wars, and Inchbald's account of it is particularly attuned to the play's capacity for a prismatic and irresolvable view of politics, an unsettled and unsettling play with a fragmentary central figure, a play that doesn't really know its own mind, and with a figure at the heart of it who really doesn't know his own mind. As A.C. Bradley says about him a few years later, a century or so later, he has no more introspection in him than a tiger. And I don't think Bradley means that in a good way. And in the journey of discovery that kind of my chapter entailed, this is what I found. So not just different readings of the play, but readings of the play which time after time in their own ways tried to say something about the fragmentary nature of the play's hero, in inverted commas, and of the play itself. Inchbald characterizes Coriolanus, the character, as blended, but only out of contradictory political impulses. And William Hazlitt, her contemporary, sees him as a complete character, he writes, but only in that he's compounded, as are we all, from paradoxes. Hazlitt writes, Coriolanus himself is a complete character. His love of reputation, his contempt of popular opinion, his pride and modesty are consequences of each other. Hazlitt might try to resolve the paradoxes of the play, but they are barely held together in a play that he claims might stand in as a substitute either for reading Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was the arch-conservative response to the events in France, or Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, which was the important radical response to the events in France. You could learn the principles of either, he suggests, from reading Coriolanus. Landing, as I do at the end of the chapter, on queer readings of the play, my more habitual critical landscape, we find readings finally that derive both pleasure and optimism from the play's intimations that the human body, as also the play itself and an idea of character, might be pleasurably paradoxical, unbounded and fragmentary, contradictory and hard to resolve. And I close the chapter with a call from Jason Edwards to celebrate the fragmentary, what Inchbald might have called blended nature of the play, and to risk, Edwards writes, opening ourselves up in spite of the fear, reality, and proximity of infection, impingement, bombardment, and the often toxic nourishment provided by other people. When I quoted and wrote about Edwards' response, I hadn't yet imagined or encountered the catastrophe of infection that is currently tracing and underlining the material truth of our unboundedness and our incapacity to resolve ourselves as individual human beings. Although, as Liam pointed out, it was something that became evident in the final kind of throes of publication. For me then, to see my chapter on this critical history within the context of the final published collection became a really interesting kind of moment, as the critical history that I'd been mapping out lived on into the subsequent chapters that I was now able to read. So responses to Coriolanus's fragmentation meet their critical match in, for example, Jennifer Ann Bates' careful and exacting Hegelian reading of what she sees, I think, as the play's failed dialectic, what she calls bad endlessness as a version of Hegel's spurious infinites, an unending unraveling of character and action in a Rome that is constructed through dialectical oppositions that can never resolve, through a failure of self-knowledge. Coriolanus the play then becomes a salutary lesson in what happens when we, both as individuals and as political communities, fail to recognize and comprehend ourselves, becoming, in Jennifer's work, a salutary attempt to persuade us that our city can be happy, but only if we avoid the pitfalls that both Coriolanus and Rome fall into. Something of the paradoxes that have characterized Coriolanus criticism across the centuries also find a landing strip in Evelyn Gajowski's chapter, her wonderful ecofeminist and presentist analysis of the play, that also comes, like Jennifer's, as a warning to avoid Coriolanus' failure to understand that his insistence on individuation, an insistence on the absolute nature of boundaries, walls, and borders in the face of a world within which our daily dependence on each other and on the world itself are driven home in a series of political and ecological catastrophes. Coriolanus criticism responds to and emerges from its moments from the 17th century to 2021. But it's also fascinating to see something of the claims on the eternal reader that literary criticism always inevitably makes in the confrontation it has with works from the past across time. This finally is how the play works. Coriolanus is a great play with which to conduct this kind of work because of its many failures to resolve itself. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hugh. And on to Rob.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, I too would like to begin by thanking Liam for being such a wonderful editor of this volume and also for the opportunity, for arranging the opportunity to speak today. Sorry, I'm going to turn off this phone for just 1 second. Beg your pardon. The essay that I contributed to this Coriolanus volume surveys the play's performance history from the early 17th century up to 2018 to 2018 production at Ontario's Stratford Festival. As Liam was saying in his very kind words about my work, that I've covered this territory before in a monograph on Coriolanus's performance history. This chapter is obviously a much shorter account of the play's stagings, or some of the play's stagings, and I included a number of productions in this chapter that I've not written on before, and it was a great opportunity to visit those productions. My argument is perhaps not very pronounced, as I was trying to offer an overview of very diverse material. Nevertheless, I did concentrate on how directors, actors, and adapters have treated performance, have treated performances of Coriolanus as opportunities for star turns that highlight celebrated actors' individual talent and magnetism in ways that are explicitly political, or in ways that reveal political commitments, even as they sidestep explicit topicality or claims of political purpose. Let's outline the chapter and what I wrote there. I dealt with the play's history of performances in a fairly straightforward chronological way, grouping discussions of productions thematically as I went. So I'll just provide a brief summary of that survey in the chapter in 4 groupings of productions. I began the chapter with what is frankly speculation about an early 17th staging of the play. We don't know if it ever was staged at all, in fact. I focus on possible moments of theatrical interest, or I speculate about those. For instance, the battle scenes and Coriolanus's final confrontation with Volumnia, noting what an opportunity the play must have offered to a leading player. I assume Burbage played Coriolanus if it happened, and whoever played Volumnia. The next section treats 3 explicitly political theatrical adaptations: Nahum Tate's Royalist, The Ingratitude of a Commonwealth, and John Dennis's and James Thompson's Anti-Jacobite Cause productions. And they've been covered much more extensively by John Ripley. Next is a section on what Ripley calls the Kemble tradition, a theatrical tradition that Ripley posits was begun by John Philip Kemble, in which the actor-manager was elevated, that particular actor-manager was elevated as the unquestioned star of the show. The production, argues Ripley, was ostensibly drained of class conflict, but this approach obviously has implications for the treatment of class. The same is true of other productions that followed in this tradition, especially, for example, Edwin Forrest's self-aggrandizing depiction of Coriolanus. The following part of the chapter examines 20th century productions that include star turns for Laurence Olivier and Edith Evans. And Olivier did end his production hanging upside down, a good 5 to 6 to 8 feet above the stage, by the way, upside down. Eckhard Schall and Helena Weigel, Ian McKellen, and Irene Worth, just to name a few. A number of the shows were explicitly political, particularly the Berliner Ensemble's production, which played in London in 1965, the Royal Shakespeare Company's staging of Gunter Grass's The Plebeians Rehearse the Uprising, and that was, like I said, 1970. Of all the productions in this section, I guess the one that I really wish I had seen, sometimes people ask me that, what do you wish you had seen that you didn't see? The one I wish I had seen is probably Stephen Burkhoff's staging from 1988-89 at the New York Shakespeare Festival, with a heavily cut text, very stylized performances starring what seems like a particularly eccentric Christopher Walken, eccentric even for Walken. Among the productions I had not worked on before, there were two that I found compelling or really interesting. The first is the 1933-1934 Comédie Francaise, Coriolanus. It seems to have been designed, another one of these productions designed to elevate the star performer, the single named Alexandre or Monsieur Alexandre, as Coriolanus. However, as many of you probably know, it became caught up in the high political stakes of France's extremely unstable and scandal-prone government or governments at the time. Here, the political context imposed itself upon the theater in the form of in-theater protests, the press, and I guess in some of its performance features as well. The other one is a production that I did see. I saw it twice, and that was the 2018 Stratford, Ontario Coriolanus, directed by Robert Lepage. It interested me particularly as, I guess what I think of as an amped up, high-tech version of Lepage's earlier French language take on the play that toured between 1992 and 94. I didn't see that, though I watched it repeatedly on archival video, so I'm familiar with it, and the 28 version is a reiteration of it. This time, the production was in English, though it did transfer to Montreal in a French language run with a different cast. And it lacked the pronounced linguistic and cultural politics of the production from the 1990s. It was a time when Canada was reconsidering whether or not it would remain a federation, or it's going to break up a little bit. Not much was made in the press about casting Black actors in 2018 as Coriolanus and Virgilia, Andre Sills and Alexis Gordon, in this case, respectively. However, both Sills and Gordon were keenly aware of what it meant for audience members to experience some diverse casting in the lead or principal Shakespearean roles at Canada's largest theatre festival. That's all I want to say about my chapter there, just to give it a sort of a quick breakdown of what I was talking about. But I do want to say a few words about Hugh Craig's essay on Coriolanus and the datasphere, which I found really compelling. At the start, I appreciated the way that Hugh establishes this distinction between, on the one hand, studying the play or plays for meaning, and on the other hand, studying the play or plays as a series of signs divorced from meaning, in which linguistic units are, quote, counted and tabulated, and, quote, and analyzed. While I didn't fully grasp some of the complexities of Hugh's statistical discussions, I could follow the gist of the tabulations and the analyses, and I very much appreciated the fact that this part of his essay was relatively intelligible to someone unschooled in statistics, such as I am unschooled. I also appreciate what I discern as Hugh's collapsing of the distinction made at the start. I hope I have this right. That is, Hugh shows links between tabulations of, for instance, repetition and, quote, the dramatist's contrasting purposes in writing dialogue, end quote. Particularly valued the modesty with which Hugh concludes the chapter. It ends not with sweeping certainties that close down discussion, but with an opening out to the prospects of further research and other perspectives on stylometry. So I thank you very much, Hugh, for that chapter. It really was fascinating. And that's all I have to say for now, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. That's terrific. And we'll skip over Graham's chapter now, which was on current trends, but we will refer to Graham a little bit later and move to Anna Kamaralli.
Thank you, Liam. And I was brought in absolute contrast to Bob. I was brought in very last minute to this project. So if he is the phenomenally in-depth authority on looking at this play with a performance eye, I'm right at the other end. I was asked to fill a gap, and my first thoughts were, I can't write about this play because I don't know if anyone here is familiar with most of my work, but it's quite oppositional. I tend to write most of my stuff because I think what's been written before was rubbish. And in this case, everything I'd ever read on Coriolanus, I thought was really smart and insightful. And I thought I will have nothing to bring to this. But those of you, I can see that there are some people in the room who are probably reasonably new to scholarship. And I tell you that the more you read, if you keep reading through everything that's been written on something as dense and rich as this, something will arise, and you will always have something to say. And in this case, what arose for me was, well, I feel like my little 5-minute talk here should possibly be given the title Apologies to Diderot. I feel very strange when I went back to look over my piece to put some words together that I realized I hadn't quoted Diderot at all, which is madness, because he wrote The Paradox of the Actor. And we've already heard from Huw extensively about how this play is built on paradoxes, and I would really like to shift that from political paradoxes, if you like, to the paradox of the actor. The absolute fundamental absurdity of the fact that actors are required to imitate sincerity. And Shakespeare, however he may have fallen on the political spectrum between conservative and radical, he was extremely daring in his approach to writing meta-theatrically. And I love this about Shakespeare because I think it shows a tremendous faith in his actors, that he repeatedly sets up situations where his actors call attention to what could be seen as their deceptiveness or the fact that they are acting. There's Cleopatra objecting to being represented by little boys. There's Hamlet explaining why bombastic speech giving is bad. So over and over again, he does this, but it all comes to an extraordinary distillation point in Coriolanus, who loathes actors. And that's his thing. He despises the idea of words in that they can be used to persuade and therefore deceive. And he really seems to behave as if those two things are synonymous. As soon as you speak with an end in mind, with an agenda, you are already being inauthentic and deceptive. And so Coriolanus's response to that is to try to speak through deeds, and he's all about how his deeds should stand. And then the poor guy finds that what happens is his deeds are mediated. After he's performed these deeds, they cannot stand for themselves. They are repeatedly given interpretation and given mediation to an end. And so I really just went through the whole play and looked at when body parts were spoken of, well, body parts I mentioned because it is very broken down into parts, when bodies are spoken of versus what we can tell from the action going on stage of what the actual bodies of the actors were doing. And every time you set those up against each other, you get a very interesting tension, a tension between how bodies are spoken of in the play versus how we know bodies must have been used in that play. And that is really all I did in this chapter in the end, because there's so much rich material once you do that, culminating in that final image of a furious Coriolanus cut down by a mob of enemies. But then once he is cut down, once he's dead, Aufidius takes that incredibly impactful physical stance, a stage image over the body of Coriolanus. And at that point, we can see Aufidius as stepping into a place of honesty, in that he first stands over the man he's conquered and then becomes one of the pallbearers, if you like, to pick up the body of Coriolanus and remove it, which is a gesture of equality and comradeship and honoring of the fallen person. So again, we have this marvelous paradox, this tension between all the speeches Aufidius has given, which were which were moving towards an end of defeating Coriolanus, then placed in tension with a theatrical, physical image of him expressing comradeship. And I think that is just what that does for us, is it shows us a play that is so anchored in the theatrical moment, even though it's so full of words. And I think that is what is really delightful about it. Now, my time's almost up, and I just want to speak very briefly to Lynn's chapter, which is coming up next, which I just can't wait to hear about. Lynn, I really do want to say a very personal thank you, first of all, for all the work you've done on presentism in Shakespeare. It's been phenomenally influential. And your chapter, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be delighted and fascinated with the very specific links you've made with the political and international political cultural moment right now. But for me, I felt like what was really valuable and what will last about your chapter is the way you really got to the heart of the process of othering in creating a theatrical character, but also for all of us in creating ourselves, this idea that Coriolanus can only know who he is through a radical separating of himself from anyone else, that you have to reject being seen as one of a group in order for him to know who he is. And yes, I thought that was very impactful, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak to that now.
Thanks so much, Anna. So let's head on then to hear Lynn.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I really appreciate those comments, Anna, and I really appreciated your book that dealt with Taming of the Shrew. So my essay was grouped together with 3 others under the new directions rubric that Liam had come up with. And the title of my essay is As If a Man Were Author of Himself, Fantasies of Omnipotence and Autonomy. I guess it started with a quotation it was kind of stimulated by Liam's invitation to write something from a presentist perspective. So what I have is kind of the core of the essay is this comparison, this comparative analysis of Marcius and Trump within an eco-feminist framework. So what, other than Liam's invitation, I guess what stimulated me to start thinking was Marcius's quotation, "Alone I did it," and how that resonated for me with very contemporary politics. Trump's sentence, "Alone I can fix it," which he said in his acceptance of the presidential nomination at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio, my hometown. So that's why I used those 2 quotations at the outset of the essay. So I go to the, my subtitles have to do with transcorporeality and hyperseparation, and a long, tall, and very powerful wall. I'm quoting Trump there. Vulnerability, a very stable genius. I'm quoting Trump there. Again, unprecedented or unprecedented. And the last section is nostalgia for the commons. So I'll just say a few words about each of those sections of my argument. Do 21st century US presidential politics illuminate Coriolanus in any meaningful way? Does Shakespeare's tragedy shed light on contemporary US presidential politics? What kinds of new meanings emerge from juxtaposing Caius, Marcius, Coriolanus, and Donald Trump for analysis? how do these two figures resonate with each other, mutually constituting each other? So those are the kinds of presentist questions that I'm asking at the outset of the essay. Then I go to my ecofeminist frame, and I depend pretty heavily on two concepts: transcorporeality by Stacey Alamo and hyperseparation by Val Plumwood. By transcorporeality, Stacey Alamo is trying to get at the phenomenon of reciprocal mutual embeddedness. The extent to which humans are always already intermeshed with the non-human world. And that clarifies the extent to which they are ultimately inseparable from the environment. And as she says, the environment is not out there somewhere. It's the very substance of ourselves. In a nutshell, she writes a whole book on the subject. In Shakespeare and ecofeminist theory, Rebecca LaRoche and Jennifer Monroe eloquently argue for the value of an ecofeminist approach to Shakespeare's King Lear, and helping us understand how it engages with the relationship between non-humans and humans. Lear dramatizes the ways in which the human is corporally intermeshed with the more than human world, unquote, as they put it, co-produced by it and with it rather than subject of it or over it. So in contrast to that phenomenon being of transcorporeal reality being dramatized by Lear and leaning heavily on LaRoche and Monroe, and I move on to hyperseparation by Val Plumwood, and I get into Trump and Coriolanus, the core of my essay. So by the concept hyperseparation, Val Plumwood is launching a critique of the binary self, other, subject, object that underlie the radical exclusion or hyperseparation of humans from other forms of life on Earth. Whereas separation stresses difference, she points out hyperseparation stresses value. So the self always, of course, has a superior value, and the other is treated as having inferior value. Separation stresses difference. The other is treated as not merely different, but inferior, part of a lower, different order of being. Differentiation from it requires not merely distinctness, but radical exclusion, not merely separation, but, to go to her term again, hyperseparation. So then I go to Marcius and Trump. They, at first glance, they would seem to have absolutely nothing in common. One is a supreme warrior, unique, even among the Romans. The other is a draft dodger who avoided military service in Vietnam after having been diagnosed with bone spurs. Closer scrutiny, however, I point out, discloses a number of significant resonances between the Roman military figure and the 21st century US political figure. Neither figure has any experience or expertise in civic life. Both are ill-equipped to take on the challenge. The transition that each needs to make or attempts to make from the military world and the entertainment or / real estate world, respectively, to the world of governance and politics results, therefore, in crisis. So the next section is called The Long, Tall, and Very Powerful Wall. And this is where I talk about various psychological and physical borders and boundaries. Resistance to various external forces defines both Marcius and Trump. For each, the survival of the self depends upon combating these forces. Impenetrable and solitary, the identity formation of each is based on an exaggerated sense of self that is primarily concerned with distinguishing the self from external forces. In the case of Trump, he is in the thrall of a fantasy whereby he can wall off the US from its neighboring Latin American nations to the south. Violence and wrath police the boundaries of the self with the intent of defining the self constantly as not other, as patrician, not plebeian, as Roman, not Volscian, not as male, not female, as rich, not poor, as US citizen, not alien, as Christian, not Muslim, as Anglo, not Latinx, as white, not black, indeed as superhuman, not human. In each of these categories, others function as objects of detestation or conquest. And I think this might be the bit that Anna was just referring to. Another section is called vulnerability. Intolerance and rigidity furthermore characterize both Coriolanus and Trump. Tolerance of others and sensitivity to others jeopardize their fragile identity formation. Neither figure has a capacity for introspection. Neither can afford to reflect on his own motives because doing so may disclose psychological vulnerability and jeopardize the fantasies of omnipotence and autonomy that are necessary for kind of psychic survival. Then the sections of very stable genius and unprecedented, treat those together. Both Marcius and Trump are in the thrall of fantasies of omnipotence and autonomy. The tribunes thereby accuse Marcius of not only aiming to be the last man standing, but also viewing himself as a tyrant or a god. Similarly, legal scholars, politicians, political pundits, US citizens alike accuse Trump of violating the rule of law that the US founding fathers inherited from Magna Carta, and of constructing himself as not only a dictator or a monarch, but also a god rather than a president. And for every one of these sentences, of course, I have quotations from Shakespeare's text and quotations from contemporary US politics. Mindful, of course, that I wrote this a year ago, year and a half ago. I turned it into Liam. After the first impeachment and just before the pandemic became a thing. It is Marcius's tyrannical behavior that Sicinius singles out as grounds for charges of treason against the people of Rome. Even though the US Senate did not convict and remove Trump from office, he too, like the banished Marcius, nevertheless joins forces with his nation's sworn enemy, the Russians. The difference is that his betrayal of his country occurred years before the Republicans in the US Senate acquitted him of charges of impeachment. As Greenblatt suggests, it is as if the leader of a political party long identified with hatred of Russia, forever saber rattling and accusing the rival politicians of treason, should secretly make his way to Moscow and offer his services to the Kremlin. And I think Greenblatt is striking very close to home there. It's not just a hypothetical. Marcius is a killing machine whose men follow him because he's a winner. A fantasy of the strong man leader that Trump desperately thinks that he is or wishes to be thought of. Hypermasculine, ubermensch, Superman. This explains his infatuation with various dictators around the globe in the 21st century, whether it's Putin, Xi, Kim Jong-un, Erdogan, Duterte, Kaczynski, El-Sisi, Bolsonaro, Orban. I haven't even named all of them, although I tried to name all of them a year and a half ago. Okay, last section, nostalgia for the commons. This is where I return to my ecofeminist framework. Marcius's fantasy of the autonomous male body tropes privatizing and closure practices that conflict with ecological models of community interrelatedness, such as governance, food, water. Simultaneous with a preoccupation with boundaries from a psychological perspective and borders or walls from a political perspective is a less noticed phenomenon, the death of the commons. The effects of the enclosure acts upon those people who had worked the land in the early modern Midlands. Shakespearean characters do not express utopian fantasies of a remote future, rather they express nostalgia for a recent past. And I'm quoting David Hawkes there in his book, Shakespeare and Economic Theory. We can hear the resonances with our present moment. Is the same true of us in the 21st century? Are we currently experiencing nostalgia for the commons? Clean air, clean water, clean living earth? Like early modern England, the US under Trump has experienced an unprecedented shift of wealth from public to private hands, as well as an unprecedented exposure of public lands to private exploitation. The tragedy for non-human species and human species on the planet is that strongmen leaders and their hyper-separation from life on Earth are insufficient to meet the demands of the 21st century. When we consider the existential threat to life on Earth posed by the contemporary climate crisis, strongman leaders' responses and military solutions are irrelevant. Not only that, they exacerbate the situation. Unfortunately, the implications of strongman leaders and their hyper-separation from life on Earth are catastrophic. What are the implications of these observations about transcorporeality and hyperseparation in early modern English and 21st century US narratives of the individual for our contemporary moment? Shakespeare's Coriolanus dramatizes the transfer of sovereignty from a tyrant to the people. The Trump presidency threatened to enact the transfer of sovereignty from the people to a tyrant. Fantasies of omnipotence and autonomy become significant not only as a psychiatric disorder of an individual, but not only as a threat to the US Democratic Republic, but also as a threat to life on Earth. It is a complicated, lengthy road from past to present, from nascent Republican Rome to the US Democratic Republic. The obsessions with boundaries, borders, and walls, and the fantasies of omnipotence and autonomy played out by Caius Marcius Coriolanus and Donald Trump constitute a tragic script the post-industrial world can no longer afford. Thanks. I don't know if I have any time left. Ooh. Do I have time to make a comment about Hugh Griffiths, or shall I?
Yeah, do please make a quick comment. Yeah, of course.
Sure. Okay. I was struck, Hugh, by what you just said in your own comments about Coriolanus becomes a player in England's culture wars. And I was, as you were going through your survey of 400 years of criticism, I noted your emphasis on the central character's complex psychology, and also the fact that the precise politics of the play have been a constant concern in Coriolanus criticism. Is Shakespeare sympathetic with the many or the few? When you get in your survey to Hazlitt pretty early on, you note that his essay on Coriolanus is similarly involved with his contemporary political moment. So I just found that from a presentist perspective, I found that very striking, that it's not only us in the late 20th century and the early 21st century that are arguing for the presence as a moment in which we are inevitably situated when we're producing Shakespeare's texts or reading them or teaching them, but that this has been happening all along for 400 years, that there's an open-ended process of interpretations by Shakespeare's texts in terms of different political, social, economic contexts. So that really kind of leapt out at me. I had more to say about Edelman and the fact that Graham mentioned Edelman, I mentioned Edelman, Hugh mentioned Edelman, but maybe we'll get to that in discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynn. That's terrific. Now, Jennifer, great to have you with us. I'd love to hear about your chapter. Jennifer, microphone.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. First, I have to say how completely honored I am to be among you all in this book, and how grateful I am to Liam for the tremendous effort you have put out in putting it together. It's really wonderful. So I'll get right to my chapter. So I'm a philosopher and a student of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit largely. So I did a Hegelian reading of the play, and the title of my chapter is Hegel's Rome and Shakespeare's Coriolanus, Grounds for Tragedy. And if you just think of German idealism as largely trying to figure out the dialectic of illusion versus a dialectic which tells us something true, then you can hear in my Hegelian reading of Coriolanus, my effort to figure out to what extent is Coriolanus, the play, successful in elucidating the illusory aspects of a kind of dialectic, and to what extent is it failing, therefore, in generating what Hegel would call a positive dialectic, in which we have some sort of understanding at the end of it. And so it's a tragedy. So what is the grounds of that tragedy? Well, I try to show that Hegel's reading of ancient Rome gives us the grounds of the tragedy. The ground is both historical, but phenomenological too. So the way that the chapter works is that I try to reveal the self-reflective mediating aspects of the play. So like the interest in doubling of names. You get your agnomen when you conquer a city, so he becomes Coriolanus. What does that mean to have another name? And then also within the play, people are interested in what's wrong with Coriolanus. So they're reflecting on his character as and trying to explain it, try to mediate it. So it's not just us who reflect on the play, but the characters are reflecting within the play on Coriolanus and the grounds of tragedy that he constitutes. So by analyzing the back and forth, the dialectic between subject and object in Coriolanus, but also in how that inflects in the Roman culture, I tease out the various problems of that he encounters. So I just have to pause for a second and tell you why I'm laboring so hard. I broke 2 ribs 2 days ago, and I've had the first week of classes. So, and this is difficult for me to put it all together for you at this particular moment. But I've prepared the way. It's just that it's a bit of a struggle. So bear with me. I've timed myself, so I won't go over. The key to the chapter is that in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about Roman legal status as the second version of an unhappy consciousness. And an unhappy consciousness is characterized by a kind of perfectionism. And in the case of Rome, the perfectionism is the more that they want to have, having come out of what Hegel thinks of as a Greek poetic time, where everything was immediate and beautiful, into a kind of doubled over time where everything is atomistically legalized, and the problems, oh dear, I've already run out of time, and the problems of character and kinship that ruled the Greek world have been sanitized into a kind of legal status. But the problem with that is that there's a remainder which they seek all the time. So the character of Coriolanus and his body and the Rome as a city is constantly trying to get at that more, it can't go back to the Greek poetic world. It's stuck in a kind of prosaic world, and it can't quite mobilize itself into something better. But it's also the site of the origins of Christianity, where we see a double name of Jesus and Christ. And I don't give a religious reading, but it is nevertheless the case that the play and Shakespeare and Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit are in the Christian tradition. And so I talk about how that inflects through the philosophical insights that Hegel brings as a religare, like a holding back, trying to figure out the mediation. So the upshot of the whole thing is that if we're not careful to analyze the media of particularly the contradictions which constitute the rhetorical self-mediations of Rome, of the ancient Rome, as we currently experience it now, we will have similar tragic problems with regard to making a happy city. We just will always be looking for the more and seeking the truth in a kind of constant mediated dialectic of illusion rather than getting to the point where we have speculative comprehension of ourselves in and through each other. So Hegel has a happy tragicomic ending to the phenomenology of spirit, but Coriolanus's Rome does not have a happy ending. It sort of dies in the body of Coriolanus, and Phidias's triumph at the end is really just more of the same. It's one fire pushing at one fire. So that I liked Anna your chapter for this reasons, because you suggest that there is an immediacy in the body, and it presented an interesting challenge to the dialectical illusion, which you called the performative, aspect of both what's happening in the play, but also of all sorts of mediation. You didn't say it outright that you thought, bodies create deeds which are honest, but the implication is that there's possibly such a thing to be found in us, in our bodies, in Coriolanus's deeds, or if not there, in Phidias's final moment of being the pallbearer. And so that would be a kind of relief, but it would also, from Hegel's point of view, be a return to a kind of Greek poetry of being and immediacy that we can't get back to, we modernists who study German idealism. And so, we want to, and that's the kind of problem that I see raging in the Coriolanus play, is that we want that immediacy, but it's sort of always forever past and to come, and yet it is in the body very much, as Coriolanus's body reflects the body politic. So I loved reading your excellent chapter. It illuminated so many things, so yeah, I hope that made sense. I apologize.
No need to apologize. We hope you're recovering too. It was a pretty nasty accident there, to have some broken ribs and still to make it here with us in the evening. So thanks so much for that. And great to hear those connections too to Anna's approach. That's fascinating. All right, we have two more speakers to go, and then we will still have a bit of time for questions, which is great. So I'll hand straight over to Huw Craig.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Liam. And I do want to start by thanking Liam, not only for giving me a pretext for the enjoyable activity of playing around with numbers in Coriolanus, which he did, but also for giving me a snappy title. So thanks for that. Yeah, much appreciated. And thanks also to Robert for his kind remarks. It just gives a nice feeling of being in a relay rather than an individual swim, as it were. This is it's the penultimate lap, as it were. So Liam gave me this opportunity. What did I do with it? I found nothing altogether unusual about the play, in the sense of making it an outlier when placed within the drama of the time, or against subsets like Shakespeare's work, or of plays around 1610, or of Roman plays. I should have tried those different sort of contexts, but it's not an outlier. I found passages that are at the extremes of a spectrum of repetitiveness versus richness of vocabulary. At the repetitive, what we might call the sitcom end, there are Phidias's servants in Act 4, Scene 5, talking about the inconvenient fact that Coriolanus routinely whacked their master whenever they crossed swords. And then at the other, the rich end of vocabulary, the more like epic end of vocabulary, there is the commentary on the battle for Coriolanus in Acts 1, Scenes 5 and 6, when Coriolanus does appear as he were flayed. I found words that are unusually common in the play, and this is thanks Liam for the tweet about the chapter, which he did for all the chapters very neatly. I found words that are unusually common in the play, like general and city. They really are common, whatever comparison group you put up against them. And words that are sparsely used in the play compared to the run of Shakespeare's plays or by others of the time, such as her, in the sense of I met her yesterday, and soul, S-O-U-L. It turns out that in terms of discourse styles, Volumnia, Orphidius, and Coriolanus are similar. They kind of group together when you look at a whole lot of characters from a lot of plays. And Menenius stands apart, making general pronouncements like them, but with an overlay of fussiness. He's more like a humorous character in the sort of larger scheme of things. The others are more like choruses or pundits. Coriolanus, the play, has lots of shared lines shared between different characters, and lots of short speeches, in line with what Shakespeare was doing generally in his late plays. The commonest line length, I mean, this is still a surprise to me, is 4 words. So that's the commonest length, roughly half a pentameter line. Coriolanus is also, we can think of it as a modern play or an up-to-date play in its use of does not doth, has not hath, and so on. Doing things numerically, you can't help putting Shakespeare in with the plays of his contemporaries. And here an odd thing happens. He does not stand out as exceptional. Coriolanus, the play follows the pattern, for instance, in speech length and modern grammatical forms, not only of late Shakespeare, but also of the run of English drama of his time. So this kind of stylistics automatically, as it were, does something to Shakespeare's claims to being exceptional. And it also automatically does something to the concept of authorship. And I think of it this way, that when you look at those the things that are common with the time, you see that not only Shakespeare, but 1608 was writing the play Coriolanus. Moving from my chapter to Claire's, which I'm about to pass the baton to her, or to touch the wall so that she can leap in. Moving from my chapter to Claire's makes you realize all the things that stylometry, which is my stock in trade, misses, which are actually the reasons people go to see a play like Coriolanus, or why students might want to study it. Claire gives a wonderful bird's eye view of approaches and materials, all interconnecting and dynamically interacting like a true complex system. I couldn't find why Coriolanus is extraordinary, but I do believe it is. And I agree in general with Robert Graves, who said Shakespeare is really very good, in spite of all the people who say that it's good. But it's all there. I couldn't find these extraordinary aspects, but it's all there. They are all there in Claire's chapter, from the terrific line she quotes about Shakespeare's metaphors being not ornaments on an already apparent world, because without the metaphors, there is no world. That's Simon Palfrey. From that to the 1607 Midlands Revolt and the challenge of recreating the staging of the storming of Coriolis in Blackfriars style in your own classroom. In Claire's chapter, there's also the odd point of connection with stylistics, e.g. the critics she quotes focusing on individual words which emerge as prominent, such as one, may, shall, and alone. She mentions all those. I should go back on, they're not the same ones that I single out, so I should go back and check on how they stack out against my standouts. And I will do that. Better still, I want to try out all the lesson plans that she's gathered, and I may even try Brian Vickers's. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Hugh. Fantastic. And over to Claire for our last author comment, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. I'll try and race us to the finish line here, so there's time for comments. Thank you so much, Liam, for having me today and for allowing me to be part of this this amazing collection. And thank you so much, Hugh, for your kind words on my chapter. You've done a much better job of highlighting it than I could. So thank you. Yeah, I'll try and keep this very, very brief. I thought what I would do is just pick out a couple of things I found interesting in terms of my teaching experience with Coriolanus, because while I was researching it and drafting this chapter, I was fortunate enough to be teaching the play at the same time as part of a level 2 subject at my university. So my students taught me a lot during that process, and some of that is reflected in the chapter. So there's 3 points I'll make based on my teaching experience at the time. And the first was the benefits I found from experimenting with the belly fable passage in the opening scene of the play. I had my students run that through staging it a range of ways during our seminars, and there were some really powerful and simple but quite powerful moments that emerged from that, both in terms of character dynamics and in terms of the inherent dynamism and flexibility of theatre, which is a really nice realization for students. Sometimes I think they do struggle to get there and think about the plays as plays. So yeah, I do really find the belly fable such a rich scene to be experimenting with and staging. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I mentioned this very briefly in the chapter, one of the challenges I found pedagogically was students' reactions to Volumnia. I mentioned that in my experience, students were quick to turn on her. And I don't necessarily have a solution for that, but it's an interesting problem to kind of ponder. And I found similar responses from educators with other Shakespeare plays. When I ran a PD for some teachers in Queensland on Macbeth earlier this year, I had teachers asking me how to deal with students who turn on Lady Macbeth and just won't open their minds to her. So I think there's some similarities there, which is perhaps a surprising thing in 2021, but it's an interesting challenge to consider. And the third part I wanted to talk about was teaching Coriolanus through a presentist framework. And I know we've talked about presentism a little bit today already. So when I taught the play to my students in 2019, I referenced the Occupy movement, which other scholars have talked about when it comes to presentism and Coriolanus. But that was just as alien to my students as the Midlands Revolt. The moment had passed. So I found myself explaining both of those things, which kind of defeats the purpose of presentism. So what I ended up using was the Extinct Rebellion, the XR movement, which is a little bit more contemporary for them. And so that was an interesting learning curve for me in terms of thinking about, I guess, the ephemerality of presentism, I suppose, and that you need to make sure that it's in touch with the students to be doing the job you want it to do. And that's really all I'll say about my chapter. As I said, I think Hugh has done a brilliant job. So thank you very much again, Hugh. The chapter I'm going to very briefly touch on is Graham's State of the Art, where he looks at political, gendered and creative approaches to adaptations of the play. And the thing that stood out for me in Graham's chapter, which I really enjoyed, was his incorporation of contemporary poetry parallels to Coriolanus. So in particular, he cites a recent article where a scholar compares the ancient Rome of Coriolanus with Belfast of the Troubles, and that's in the poetry of Kieran Carson, in particular Belfast Confetti. So I hadn't read it, so I went and had a look, and I found it really, really illuminating, particularly in its use of language, or its sort of collision of language and violence, or language as violence. And he also referenced, of course, T.S. Eliot's Coriolanus poems. Holderness writes that for him, Eliot's poems are not only informed by an acute reading of the play, but offer a new kind of reading, a critical creative intervention designed to stand alongside Shakespeare's play. And in terms of kind of a pedagogical angle, I think there's so many opportunities for incorporating works like Eliot's and Carson's and critical creative approaches in the classroom. So that's something else to think about, and I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thanks for your comments there on Graham Holderness's chapter on current scholarship on the play. And a big thank you to everybody who opted in on the project. It's just fantastic to have you all writing such great chapters. And I hope that the account that we've just delivered will illustrate how probably not just how the book went over length, but also how the book has quite a diverse range of approaches or methodologies or touches into disciplinary areas. And from that point of view, I really hope it's a fertile and important challenge for readers to try and get to grips with all the different approaches, and it certainly illuminates the play in multiple ways. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a